Welcome to the John Brown University Chapel podcast, recorded in the historic Cathedral of the Ozarks in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. This week's chapel speaker was Dr. Keith Jagger, University Chaplain at John Brown University. Prior to coming to JBU, Keith served in pastoral ministry in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Keith earned his doctoral degree in New Testament at St. Andrews in Scotland.
So having prepared our hearts in song, we come to the feet of our Master, ready to hear in the older parts of his story, his voice and his word for us today. Dr. Pollard and Tracy did us a great service last week by setting our minds into Exodus, which is our semester's focus. My portion of the story today runs from chapters 5 to chapters 13, so we're going to get an eagle-eye view of it today, but I'm going to also focus in and drill down on two really small but important details, and they're like the baby version of biblical themes that are going to grow across the whole narrative. And so I can't wait to zero in on them. We have Moses returning to Egypt today after his exile, and then the story of the 10 phases of God's attack on the evil system of slavery in Pharaoh's Egypt. But our point of entry today is actually in Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews is a book of the Bible in the New Testament, written just after Jesus' death, thousands of years after Moses and his generation lived. So along with our four Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, Hebrews is written by one of the earliest Christians meditating on the person and the work of Jesus and how the Christian community gets forged around Jesus and his way. Chapter 4 of Hebrews reads like this. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors put me to the test, though they had seen my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation, and I said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they have not known my ways. It's kind of a gloomy thing, don't you think, to be remembered in this way? Always going astray, stiff-necked, failure to understand God. The author of Hebrews wants us to know something that the people of God have seen ever since the Exodus generation lived. There was something deeply wrong with that generation. And the reason why we remember them, I mean, you and I aren't going to be remembered 3,000 years later, so at least they got that. But the reason why we remember them is because we are not immune ourselves to what infected them. We must pay attention to their failures if we want to be a people humble in heart, who actually are able to come to know God's ways. It's not inevitable that we won't stall out in the desert of our lives, in disobedience and ignorance, as high as our ambitions may be. So when you look across the rest of the Old Testament and the story of the New Testament, with Jesus murdered on the Passover, the annual festival remembering God's freeing the people of Egypt, and when you hear Paul saying, as he does in Romans, that sin is like a slave master, you see that Moses and the law and that generation are not some sort of like alternative way of religion. They are for us the people of God, and we come to see ourselves in them. So I'm not sure what you guys are expecting in the next 50 years of this world, or even the next 10 years of this world. I mean, things look like they're boiling out there if you're looking at the same world I'm looking at. And it may cool down, who knows. But at John Brown, our hope is to prepare you for a world that in 10, 15 years, who knows what the socio-political situation will look like? Who knows what your life will look like? You may go through 1, 2, or 3 really big life events of physical brokenness or personal brokenness, and the future is uncertain. And it would, I think, be a real travesty if I think it would be an injustice, really, not to open this part of the story for you as we go through this time. And so that's why we're doing this. We're looking back at this generation, looking at what went wrong, how to be the people of God in a really difficult time. So with that in mind, let's jump right into the story. Moses, says Exodus chapter 4, verses 18, went back to his father-in-law, Jethro, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt, and see if they're still living. And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." The Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who are seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. I love this part of the story. Moses, once supremely familiar with the civilization and wonders of Egypt, he's now returning to a vast unknown. It's a moment of history, fully bloomed, ripe for God's plan. He's going to shift 430 years of the status quo. We get a sense that while Moses in his years of exile may have thought often of his time in Egypt, he never once in 40 years returned. He didn't know if his mother was alive or if his brothers were alive or his sisters or his cousins. And it was God, actually, who was the one who told them that the older Pharaoh died and that it's now time to go back. This was a true and complete 40-year exile for Moses. And now, on the heels of God, he's rushing back into the land of his youth. And the time was ripe. He could now return in relative safety to Egypt, and God could begin his rescue. With a young and likely prideful Pharaoh on the throne, a new Pharaoh with political alliances back in Egypt recalibrating. This is not to say that in God's sovereignty, God needed a weaker Egypt. It's just interesting, isn't it, that he chose a time of a youthful Pharaoh, more reckless, more in need to prove himself, to come in just at the right time. And this Pharaoh not only was recalibrating political alliances, but really trying to probably keep the hold on the Israelites like his father had. And so we see God working gently in the self-imposed confines of human history. This is why I imagine the first thing that Moses and Aaron did was to get back to Egypt and call the meeting of the elders. It's the first thing they did. They must have been shocked to see Moses, who had been gone for so long. And Moses' brother Aaron speaks to them, and this is what he says. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses on the mountain, and then performed the signs in the sight of the people. That is, back among the elders of Egypt, they brought the staff and turned it into a snake and turned it back to a staff again. And he put his hand in his cloak and it brought it out and it was leprous, and put it back in and brought it out and it was immediately healed. These were the elders that needed to be convinced, because these were the people who were maybe the most connected to the older Pharaoh, most loyal to the older Pharaoh. And you might think that's interesting, a slave loyal to a slave master. But the systems of slavery in this world are only probably 10 to 15% about shackles and walls and fences. 80% of slavery is about psychological slavery. I mean, it's the way that slavery works today. I don't know if you know this, but there's modern day slavery in the world. It's called human trafficking. And the way it works is a pimp or a John goes down to a village somewhere and gets to know the community, gets to know the names of the people in the community, and then says that they're there to take their children to college in Europe or America. And when they recruit a handful of young people to come to Europe or America, they say, we're going to pay your way, we have scholarships available, and the family sends them off with celebration. And then when they get across the ocean or across the border, they get put into menial work on a farm somewhere with no pay, or you get locked up in a hotel room for weeks on end on our interstate systems. You may not know this is happening, but this is happening all around us. And there's no physical shackles, there's no actual walls put up for these slaves. It's psychological. The pimps and the Johns and the traffickers say, I know the names of your parents, the names of your brothers, the names of your sisters. If you run away, if you get free, I'm going to go kill them. And so they're trapped in this psychological slavery. And we see this with people who get kidnapped. Sometimes we hear these crazy, horrific stories of people being trapped in basements for decades or years as slaves. And then they come forward and they have this weird affection to their captors. Slavery does a number on the human condition. And this is what it was probably like. I mean, I think probably the most infuriating thing about being a slave in a concentration camp or in the system of slavery in Egypt is that you begin to see a hierarchy of slaves happening. The slave master knows to give special favors to one or two slaves, and they kind of become the leaders of the slaves. They have special comforts even though they're slaves nonetheless. They're resented for their special privileges, but somehow they still have loyalty to the slave masters. Slavery is mostly psychological, if you study it. And so this is why Moses and Aaron come straight back to the elders, because these are the people who probably have these strange affections and loyalties and this weird evil sense of safety in the midst of slavery. And they convince them, of course, they convince them with the miracles, they convince them with the words, and they get their hopes held high that God is finally going to free them. And then Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and ask for the emancipation of Israel. And rather than relenting, rather than setting them free, Pharaoh hardens his heart and says, no, you are lazy. That's why you want to leave. You're gonna flee. And so I'm going to make life doubly hard on you. And he does. And he screws down the system of slavery upon them. And the Israelites get more beaten and more beaten up. So it's no wonder then that the elders, after this experience, end up cursing Moses. And Moses goes back to God in his time of prayer and says, you said you're going to set us free. You said you were going to act greatly. And here we are. Things are worse. And God reassures them, Moses, okay, now it's time. You're going to see, not with signs, I mean, you'll see the great signs, but right now I'm not going to give you more signs. I'm just going to reiterate my promise to you. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. And Moses told this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and cruel slavery. So now the storm is coming. God is fully ready to emancipate his people with dramatic acts of creation. But this moment, this little detail here, I think really tells us so much. Everything we need to know about this generation. And that's what I would like to drill down on today. They would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and cruel slavery. This is the first description, I think, of Israel's sin. The great sin of Israel that would hold them in the desert for 40 years. Something that they would have to take responsibility for ultimately, but something they ultimately didn't do to themselves. Something that would take them a long time to work out of their system. And next time I'm with you in February, I'm going to unpack this idea that sin is more complicated, more complex than we give it credit for. That you see here that Israel's refusal to listen to Moses, the rebellion growing in their heart, that's something that is true about them. They cannot deny that they are broken and twisted and unlike they were meant to be in their full freedom. But it is also something that happened to them. Another agent did it to them. And as we think of sin and what sin is, we always have to hold these two truths together. I'm going to unpack that next time for us. It's our own responsibility, but there's some other agent that has initially done it to us. So that's next time. But this week, I just wanted to talk about two more things, drill into two ideas. First, that whatever was in them, this sin, this complex sin in them, it's going to take them a long time to work it out. And to help us catch a glimpse of this, to get us ready for this, I think it's helpful to think about the four main locations that they live in for 40 years. We know about Egypt. Egypt is the land of their slavery, and God's about to take them out of it. That's location one. Second location is Sinai, Mount Sinai. They go out to the desert and they stay a year at Mount Sinai as they build their new civilization up. We listen, like we watch the movies Prince of Egypt and maybe 10 Commandments, and we know about the first part of the story. But that's just the beginning. They go to Sinai, they go to Mount Sinai, they get the 10 Commandments and live there for a full year. And then they go to this place called Kadesh Barnea, and that's where they wander for 40 years. And then they go up to the Holy Land at a place called the Plains of Moab. And of course, there's all the wandering in between. And the story is told in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, yeah, we're in the book of Exodus, but you'll see that we're eventually going to get to Numbers and Deuteronomy as well. The whole generation and its whole story is what we're after this semester. And what we see from this is that their journey lasted a long time. Their journey to freedom, as our preacher on Tuesday, Pastor Smith told us, their journey to freedom. I loved his little phrase, from brokenness to breakthrough. That really stood out to me. But the whole journey to freedom lasts a long time. And we see that God was not only interested in their physical freedom, but he was going to work out their psychological freedom as well, their spiritual freedom, we might say. And I think that's what explains the waiting. So, when we are confused by the Israelites, when they start to panic in the wilderness, when on Mount Sinai they hear the voice of God, but they don't want God to talk to them, when Moses is gone for 40 days up on a mountain, and instead of being patient, they craft a new idol for them to worship in a golden calf, when Aaron's sons end up dying because of irreverence, when the people in the desert long for Egypt because back in Egypt they had watermelon. Man, it was so good back then. Our babies could be killed at whim, but man, those melons. What in the world, Israel? When they would trade their freedom in for that, when Miriam and Aaron burn with jealousy for Moses, when the people lament because the spies went into Canaan and came back with stories of giants, when they wage war with people that God tells them not to, when a whole section of the Israelites under the leadership of Korah revolts, and when the people are on the border of their promise and start to worship Baal. This verse must continue to resonate in our minds. They would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and cruel slavery. So I invite us to hold that verse in our minds as we go forward. So this is the first lesson, this complexity of slavery, this complexity of sin, and this beautiful, long work of freedom. But the last thing I want to do today is to highlight one more little detail. If the first lesson we take is about sin, the second lesson we take is just as important, and it's about the way to freedom. Rhythms of work and worship free us. In particular, worship, corporate embodied worship, that which we're doing right now, was the thing that God instituted to free them from their slavery, their mental, spiritual slavery. That is to say, if slavery is the best metaphor for sin in the scriptures, then the best metaphor for what worship is, why we do this, is about the journey of becoming free from the effects of slavery upon us, especially slavery to sin. Here's what I mean. When the elders of Israel, when they first heard that God had chosen Moses to free them, their first impulse was to worship. Not to strategize, not to problem solve, but what they did is they gathered and bowed down in praise, turning their minds and hearts to God. Every time that Moses asked Pharaoh to release Israel, it was for this purpose, to go out into the desert and worship their God. And when you follow this thread of worship, you see that half of the material in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, half of what you read is about how to worship. God orders their daily life in their civilization around his physical presence in the manifestation of the cloud. He orders their life weekly around a Sabbath, that is, a pause on slavish task orientation. To delight in his creation and to delight in his presence. And he organizes their whole year around festivals of worship that remind them of who God is and what he's done. And as followers of Jesus, our life gets ordered in a similar way. We need to worship ongoingly if we're not going to live out an ongoing life of task-oriented slavery and idolatry. Corporate embodied worship, whether we understand it or feel it or each time or not, corporate embodied worship frees us from anxiety. It frees us from our brokenness. It frees us from excessive fear, from pride, from self-sufficiency. Rhythms of corporate embodied worship free us from the powerful illusions that we can get onto in our mind and the fantasies and our patterns of rebellion. We need worship not just to orient our life, but also to heal us. We need freedom in our minds, in our bodies, and the way that God designed worship was to be embodied, that is, full sensory, involving the movement of our bodies. Worship is like an act of intentional loyalty to God, but it is also the way, I'm contending, that God has chosen to heal and free us. Of course, in Christ, our whole life is worship. But corporate worship, setting aside time as a community to testify that we're not task-oriented slaves, but free children of God, is what we're doing. It's where we move from being captured to captivated. And we really don't make this move without worship. And it's why we do this at John Brown in an incentivized way. No matter what your walk or outlook of life, when you're part of this community, we want to give you the best chance as possible to value corporate worship and to teach you how to use this space for your ongoing freedom. It's interesting for me to watch you guys contend with this chapel credit system as this incentivized worship kind of works against the pressures and powers in our life. I think the most extreme reaction that I've seen so far is this. I don't understand why they force everyone to go to chapel and then they transfer away. And I'm not shaming those who believe that and do that. It just makes me sad because I think those people aren't yet in touch with the opportunities of this time and space. They probably haven't ever really experienced in this time and space that self-forgetting movement in the rhythms of music and word that send healing chills down into the bruised and broken places of their spirit. Or the feeling that although in a crowd of 1,000, once again, a phrase or a turn of phrase from the preacher makes me realize that the Lord is here and God knows exactly what I need to hear and what needs to be lifted up. Hey, here's the secret. I don't remember what I preached about last time. Neither will you. But God is working, and you may remember a story or a phrase that hits you in the perfect way. Or maybe these people haven't even experienced their own agency in this space, that it's a time for them to contend with their traumas by journaling or drawing or praying. Folks haven't yet learned to use this time and space as a time to reset. I think these folks see this space as an obstacle to their mental health and well-being. And that makes me profoundly sad, not because I'm offended in any way, but it's like a person turning away strong medicine and continuing to suffer. Most folks, I think, who struggle with coming to chapel and the chapel credits, I think feel that they've just committed their life to far too much. And they see this, they feel this need to achieve, this time to, in this culture that wants our incessant productivity. You want to get the grades, pad the bank accounts, find identity and meaning in work. And work is a great thing, don't get me wrong. Finding freedom financially is wonderful. But this school, John Brown, is suggesting that by instituting corporate embodied worship, that life is incomplete without times of abandon and praise and confession and lament. And that we run the danger of being enslaved over and over again without this intentional choice to pause. So throughout the semester, I'm going to trace this thread of worship for us and talk a little bit more about why we do chapel the way we do and how to use this space for your healing and freedom. I was one of my favorite moments of worship in all of my life. I had a chance to travel in college to Russia. I got to go to a city that was a few hours west of Moscow, and we were at a youth conference, and all of the worship was completely in Russian. I had no idea what the songs were or what they were saying, But I found this moment, the Lord gave me this moment where I worshiped nonetheless. No matter what was served up in front of me, I took agency, and I chose to worship despite what was in front of me. And I remember afterwards, one of the worship leaders came up who I was getting to know and said, "Keith, how do you know Russian?" I'm like, "I don't know Russian." She's like, "Well, you were singing the worship songs." I was like, "Yeah." So in this space, what I'm saying is, when you see your neighbor doing homework or watching a movie or flipping through Instagrams, like, no one's coming around with a big Moses stick to crack those screens. Like, this is a place of mutual respect. You do you. You have agency to use this space however you choose. Our job is regularly to challenge you and to equip you and to teach you to use this space for healing, to worship, to turn our hearts to God, to recognize that this time isn't an interruption to what is real, but that this is the true reality of life, a life tuned into God in these beautiful rhythms of work and worship. Oh man, I can't wait for next time. I got more to say about this. Well, the story races on from here of Moses. And of course, God comes and dramatically rescues his children from the slavery of Egypt. We'll keep diving in here and looking at this story about freedom. But what I'm saying is that until we put our brains and our minds and our hearts into the complexity of sin, which is the Israelites show us, and the amazing gift of worship that frees us from that slavery, we will be wandering like they were. We get there, we get to this beautiful reality by trying to answer the question, how could these people struggle so much? And why was a lifetime in the desert what God thought these people needed? And as we continue to understand their unique experience, I think we'll discover what we have in common with them. And we will find our way together to real, robust, nourishing, and unsurpassable freedom. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the John Brown University Chapel Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes or whatever platform you're listening on, and we'd love it if you would leave us a review.